Hello everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel. Myself Kushi.D from Sri Venkateswara College of Engineering. So today's topic would be configuring Raspberry Pi in IoT. So coming to the introduction, configuring Raspberry Pi involves setting up the operating system, connecting peripherals, and customizing settings. Raspberry Pi is a versatile single board computer that can be used for various projects and applications. Proper configuration ensures optimal performance and functionality of the Raspberry Pi. So getting started with Raspberry Pi. To configure Raspberry Pi, you will need a micro SD card with operating system, power supply, HDMI cable, and peripherals. Insert the micro SD card with the operating system into the Raspberry Pi and connect it to a display using the HDMI cable. Power on the Raspberry Pi by connecting the power supply and you should see the boot screen on the display. So the initial setup and configuration. Following on the screen prompts to set up the language, time zone, and other basic settings of the Raspberry Pi. You can configure the network settings to connect the Raspberry Pi to the internet via Wi-Fi or Ethernet. It is recommended to update the operating system and software packages to ensure security and stability. So moving on to the next slide, we have advanced configuration options. Customize the desktop environment, install additional software, and configure user accounts on the Raspberry Pi. Enable SSH, that is nothing but secure shell, for remote access to the Raspberry Pi, and configure firewall settings for security. Explore advanced configuration options such as overclocking, boot options, and system optimizations. So moving to the next slide, we have setting up GPIO pins. So GPIO stands for General Purpose Input-Output pins on the Raspberry Pi allows you to connect and control external devices. Configuring GPIO pins using software libraries such as RRPI, GPIO, or PIG-PIO to interact with sensors, LEDs, motors, and more. Properly configure and test GPIO pins to ensure compatibility and functionality with external hardware. So configuring remote access. Set up VNC, which is nothing but virtual network computing, or SSH for remote desktop access to the Raspberry Pi from another device. Configure port forwarding on your router to access the Raspberry Pi remotely over the internet. Use tools like TeamViewer or Real VNC for easy remote access and control of the Raspberry Pi. Moving on to the next slide, we have configuring storage and file sharing. Configure external storage devices such as USB devices or network attached storage, that is NAS, for additional storage space. Set up Samba or NFS to share files and folders between the Raspberry Pi and other devices on the network. Use cloud storage services like Dropbox or Google Drive for cloud-based file sharing and synchronization. Moving on to the next slide, we have securing your Raspberry Pi. So in this slide, we will be getting to know like how to secure the Raspberry Pi. So implement security measures such as changing default passwords, enabling firewall settings, and updating software regularly. So these are some of the security measures that could be taken to secure the Raspberry Pi. Use encryption tool like BitLocker, or VeraCrypt to secure sensitive data stored on the Raspberry Pi. So if some sensitive data is stored on the Raspberry Pi, you can either use BitLocker or VeraCrypt. So, and also monitor system logs, install antivirus softwares, and be cautious of potential security risks to protect your Raspberry Pi. So, next slide would be configuring audio and video. So set up audio output setting for sound playback through HDMI, 3.5 mm audio jack or USB audio devices. Configure video settings for display resolution, orientation, and dual monitor setup on the Raspberry Pi. So these are some of the settings that you should be doing for audio and video settings. And also we need to install media player software like VLC or Kodi for multimedia playback and streaming on the Raspberry Pi. So this image depicts for this explanation. And also moving to power management and energy efficiency. Enable power saving features, adjust screen brightness, and manage power consumption settings on the Raspberry Pi. Utilize sleep mode, hibernation, or automatic shutdown to reduce energy usage and prolong the life of Raspberry Pi. Consider using a power-efficient power supply and implementing power management strategies for optimal energy efficiency. And coming to configuring wireless connectivity. Set up Wi-Fi and Bluetooth connections on the Raspberry Pi for wireless communication with other devices. Configure wireless access points, connect to Bluetooth peripherals, and troubleshoot connectivity issues. Use tools like Bluetooth CTL or WPA supplicant to manage wireless connections and settings on Raspberry Pi. Moving on to the next slide, we have monitoring and performance tuning. So monitor system resources, CPU usage, memory, consumption, and temperature to optimize performance. Use tools like HedgeTop, IOTop, or Systat to track system performance metrics and identify bottlenecks. And also performance tuning by adjusting system settings, disabling unnecessary services, and optimizing software for better efficiency. Configuring web services and servers. Set up web servers like Apache LightPD on the Raspberry Pi for hosting websites or web applications. Configure database servers like MySQL, PostgreSQL, or SQLite for storing and managing data on the Raspberry Pi. Install web development frameworks like Flask, Django, or Node.js for creating dynamic web applications on Raspberry Pi. Moving on to the next slide, we have automating tasks with cron jobs. Use cron to schedule automated tasks, scripts, backups, and maintenance jobs on the Raspberry Pi. Configure cron jobs to run at specific times, intervals, or events for hand-free operations. Utilize cron expressions, log files, and error handling to manage and troubleshoot cron jobs effectively. Implementing IoT, Internet of Things projects. So using Raspberry Pi for IoT projects by connecting sensors, actuators, and devices to connect and exchange data. Configure MQTT, COAP, or other IoT protocols for communication between Raspberry Pi and IoT devices. Build IoT applications for home automation, environmental monitoring, smart agriculture, and more using Raspberry Pi. So here we would be discussing configuring camera modules. So enable and configure camera modules like the Raspberry Pi cameras or USB webcams for capturing photos and videos. So use software libraries like PyCamera or OpenCV to control camera settings. So implement computer vision, image processing, and video streaming applications using camera modules on Raspberry Pi. So how do you do troubleshooting and what are the common issues? So identify and troubleshoot common issues such as boot errors, network connectivity problems, and software conflicts. Check system logs, error messages, and hardware connections to diagnose and resolve issues on Raspberry Pi. Seek help from online forums, documentation, and community support to troubleshoot challenging problems effectively. So this is the flow chart which represents it. And then moving on to the next slide, we have backing up and restoring data. So create regular backups of your Raspberry Pi's data, configurations, and settings to prevent data loss. Use tools like rsync, DD, or backup software to create full or incremental backups of the Raspberry Pi. Implement disaster recovery plans and test backup procedures to ensure data integrity and availability in case of emergencies. So moving on to expanding and customizing Raspberry Pi projects. Explore add-on boards, hats that is nothing but hardware attached on top, and accessories to expand the capabilities of the Raspberry Pi. Customize and modify Raspberry Pi projects by integrating sensors, displays, motors, and other components. Share your Raspberry Pi projects, code, and experience with the community to inspire and collaborate with each other. So moving on to the next slide, we have conclusion and resources. In conclusion, configuring Raspberry Pi requires setting up the hardware, software, and peripherals to meet your project requirements. Refer to official documentation, online tutorials, forms, and community resources for guidance and support in the configuring Raspberry Pi. Get creative, experiment, and have fun exploring the endless possibilities of Raspberry Pi for learning, prototyping, and innovation. So, in the next, thank you. Please do like my video and share it with your friends. Thank you.